Today's story time. It's not the greatest story, but it's a story that I wanted to share. I found out this morning when I was flipping through my news feed that Kenny Rogers had passed away. He was 81 years old. Now, this story is about Kenny Rogers. He and I were not friends, but we did interact a few times, and I wanted to tell you about the Kenny Rogers that I knew. And you may not have known this, but Kenny Rogers was a hell of a photographer. The story starts about 10 years ago. I had just kind of finished up my time at the Portfolio Center here in Atlanta, photography school, and he called them looking for somebody who was good at Adobe Lightroom, and they knew I was teaching workshops in Lightroom and that I had been a big Lightroom teacher in the area, and so they recommended me to him, and he called me. And he goes, "Hey, my name's Kenny Rogers. I don't know if you know who I am." And what's funny about that is I grew up, my dad and mom played classics and country music when I was growing up. So of course I know who Kenny Rogers is. And he goes, "I was looking for somebody to help me in Lightroom. Would you be available? And if so, what's your hourly rate?" And I was like, a one-on-one workshop sort of a thing with Kenny Rogers as my student. Very, I just said, all right, my rate's $50 an hour, and I'm pretty available if you want to set something up. So he goes, "I'll give you a call in a couple days and we'll set something up." And so sure enough, first of all, I thought, okay, he's never going to call me again. But sure enough, a couple days later, he called me up and he goes, "Would you have time today to come by around six o'clock and show me a few things in Lightroom?" And I said, "Sure, yeah, I'll come by." And so he gave me an address here in Atlanta, and I went to his house, and he let me in. He was wearing sweats and a t-shirt, and looking like Kenny Rogers. And he pulled out kind of what at the time was a little bit of an old laptop, an old Mac laptop. And he pulled up, he opened it up, and he just was explaining a lot of things, and he liked to talk a lot. And I was just I was there to work. I was there to teach him about Lightroom, and it turns out that some of the questions he had about his images were based on a hard drive out in California, and so linking the files wasn't something we could do. To fast forward a little bit, he ended up saying, "Well, why don't I get my files and then you can come back and then we'll really get going." And so, in that conversation, he of course showed me some of his photography work that was hanging on the walls, and he gave me a copy of two of his books, Kenny Rogers, Your Friends and Mine, and Kenny Rogers, This Is My Country. And both of those two books are portrait books. And turns out he was a really good photographer, and he showed me some of his landscape work as well. And he was a really good landscape photographer, and he was super into it. And I didn't know that about him, and a lot of people don't. You may not have known that until you're watching this video. So what I'd like to do is I'd like to show you some of these books. I'm just going to have the camera, and I'm just going to flip through, and I may talk a little bit about some other stuff while we go. And so he asked me he asked me again what my rate was as I was leaving, and I was only there for 1 hour, and I was like, "Well, it's $50," and he gave me $100, and he just said, "Well, when you work for me, it's $100." And I just thought that was really pretty cool. A nice gesture. He knew I was young and that I was in the creative field. Obviously, we don't make a lot of money, so he knew that a tip would go a long way. And I never took advantage of that in any way. I had his phone number at that point, and there was things I thought of maybe I can call him up. Obviously, I'm a professional, and there was no reason for me to talk to him after that until he was ready. And so some time went by. I think I did call him and leave a message, and I never got a call back. He was heading out on his Christmas music tour after that. right around then. So he said maybe after the tour, I'll get my drive and we'll meet back up. But I didn't hear from him. And then about 2 years later, I get a voicemail, and it's him, and he goes, "Hi Kendrick, this is Kenny Rogers. A while back, you helped me with some Lightroom stuff. I don't know if you remember that or not." I was like, "Of course I remember that. Who would forget that?" And he goes, I was wondering if you could come out and help me with some Lightroom stuff." And I said, I called him back and I was like, "Yeah, I'd love to." And he gave me a different address because he had moved and he was still in Atlanta. And I go out to his house, and we talked about Lightroom, but we didn't actually do anything. And he asked me then, it was like, "Would you like, maybe we can go out shooting some point?" And I was like, "Heck yeah, I'll take you out around in Atlanta and we'll shoot some stuff. We're going to, we'll shoot stuff." And we didn't end up doing that. I wish we would have. That would have been really cool, but we didn't end up doing that. It was just a really great conversation, and I learned a lot from him, even in those conversations. Some of the stuff I learned from him is what I wanted to share here in this video, in this moment. One is like to be generous, be kind and generous, and that was with the double the tip or double the hourly rate. Because when you're working with me, it's $100 an hour. So I thought that was when you're able to be generous with people, and they'll be thankful and they'll remember that. And then second, we talked a little bit about music and how I thought his storytelling and his music was really good, and he lit up and he goes, "That's exactly right. I think that the crux of writing anything is about storytelling, and the crux of most of the creative work is about storytelling, and that's what I'm trying to do in my photos. That's what I'm trying to do in my songs, trying to tell stories." And so I think that is something you can take away from, is that there's a lot of different ideas, but you have to tell a story in your work if you want it to connect. And I think that's really important. Another thing that I got out of one of the books, I didn't have this conversation with him, but he said, when you're taking somebody's picture, there are three ways you can photograph somebody. And that is the way that they see themselves, the way that others see them, and a way that they've never been seen before. So a unique way. And he said he liked to do all three, but his favorite was the third way, which is to show somebody the way they've never been seen before. And in these books, I'm gonna show you some of these pictures out of these books, just so you can get a sense of the photographer that he was, the powerhouse of a photographer and a portrait photographer that he was. And you can see in some of his work that it was challenging lighting conditions that he had set for himself. Even in the studio, he had chosen to do some stuff that's hard. He used a lot of mirrors, and that's hard. That can be real hard with reflections. Mirrors can be real challenging, but he liked to challenge himself as a photographer. On a technical level, some of the stuff that I found out was that he shot the material for these two books I'm going to show you. He shot them on 8x10 and 4x5. So he was, this was obviously in the 80s and 90s and 2000s. He was working at, and digital wasn't an option then, but he was working with some of the best photography equipment available. And when he's talking about one of these pictures, he actually, it was on location, and he shot it in 4x5, and then he got back to the studio and developed it, and he didn't like it because it wasn't 8x10, so he went back with the 8x10 camera and shot it again. And that just kind of shows again how much of a perfectionist he was on a technical level. He wasn't just some guy with a camera because he could afford it. He studied and he learned, and he became very, very, very technically proficient in shooting, in lighting, in creatively with the concepts of these images. One of the interesting things he told me in the conversation that I had with him was that he was an investor in a company called Calumet, and they make photography gear, and I actually have some of their lighting modifiers, and I just thought, man, that's like somebody you don't know, this celebrity is investing in camera technology. I think that's really cool. I also learned out of the books that his preferred lighting setup was Broncolor lights. He had 3,200 watt second lights, the A4 system, and he used soft boxes a lot. And he also worked with a lot of accent lighting. And you'll see in some of these images there's some accent lighting. And so he had this term that he called layered lighting, and he thought that was the way that he wanted to work, was foreground light, subject light, background light, and then there's a black zone in there that he can use dark or black as another element of the lighting. So I thought that was actually pretty interesting. There was a quote that I wanted to share with you, just kind of about what his approach to working with people was. He goes, "I wanted to offer my subjects enough latitude they would be proud of the picture too. If that meant reordering my preconception of someone, so be it." And I think that's really important as a portrait photographer, to understand that you're shooting a picture of somebody and they have feelings and they have emotions, and ideally they are proud of the picture you're trying to take of them as well. You're not trying to take pictures of somebody in a deceitful way, or you're hiding a technical trick from them, and then when they get the image it makes them look bad, and it's just not a good way to do business. And so working with your subject to help them look the way that not necessarily they want to be looked at, but to make a picture they would be proud of. Well, thank you for watching this video. I actually really appreciate the fact that you watched it. I know that the stories I share about Kenny Rogers are nothing in comparison to what other people knew of the man. But I learned some stuff from it. And because not a lot of people even know he was a photographer, I wanted to make this video. I wanted to share some of the little stories I have about Kenny Rogers, the photographer. Thanks for watching. I'll catch you on the next one.